What happens when a foundational, life-altering experience, one that sort of defines a movement, a face, even a people, is retold not just once, but many times over decades? Can that story evolve in its details without compromising the very core of its truth?
It's a really profound question, and it's exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at one of the most pivotal events in Latter-day Saint history. Joesph Smiths claimed 1820 vision of God the Father and Jesus Christ, often called the first vision. For millions, it's not just a story, it's the keystone, really, the bedrock of the church's origin.
Exactly. And for anyone familiar with Latter-day Saint history, yeah, the first vision is foundational. But what truly fascinates us today, and what really sparks a profound debate, are the variations in how Joesph Smith himself recounted that pivotal experience, over 2 decades, no less.
Right. And to some people, these evolving narratives, they signal a problem. Maybe with Joseph's honesty suggesting fabrication. But to others, they're seen as natural products of, human memory, context, audience, not evidence of deceit, but maybe more like a testament to a living, unfolding testimony.
So our mission today is to try and cut through some of that noise and offer you a truly nuanced look at this issue. We've pulled together a really exhaustive, balanced stack of scholarly sources. We've got official Latter-day Saint scholars interpreting things through a framework of faith, secular historians using different methods, critical voices who openly challenge the narratives, and even cognitive scientists specializing in memory.
Yeah, we'll explore what Joseph's evolving story does and maybe what it doesn't imply about his honesty. Get ready for some surprising facts, I think, that might reshape how you see this.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Joesph Smith is a 14-year-old farm boy. He claimed to have this remarkable vision in a wood grove back in 1820, a place we now know as the Sacred Grove.
And his most famous narrative, the one most people know, states he prayed to figure out which church to join and was visited by 2 divine personages, God the Father and Jesus Christ, who told him, basically, join none because all the existing churches were wrong.
This vision, like you said, became the keystone of Joseph's prophetic identity and the LDS Church's origin story. But here's a crucial detail, one that often surprises people. Joesph didn't actually publish a written account of this vision until 1842. That's over 20 years after the event supposedly happened.
Right. And in that time, in that interim, he recounted it several times, verbally and sometimes in writing.
And this is where it gets really interesting. We're going to focus on 4 main first-hand accounts. The ones from 1832, 1835, 1838, and 1842. And each one was created under pretty different circumstances. Some were private diary entries, others were meant as public documents.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating, historically speaking, is how obscure these accounts actually remain for a lot of the 19th century. Your average early LDS convert in the 1830s, they weren't primarily taught about a first vision like we think of it today.
Really? So what were they taught?
Well, the official church publications, the missionary tracts back then, they really put the emphasis on the Book of Mormon, on angelic visitations like the angel Moroni appearing. The 1820 vision just wasn't the main focus yet.
Huh. That is surprising.
It is. Historian James B. Allen points out the first vision was not circulated in church periodicals or missionary literature through most of the 1830s. It wasn't until 1838 that Joesph actually prepared a version intended for publication. And only by the early 1840s did it really start getting wide circulation.
And the 1838 account, that's the one that eventually got canonized as scripture in 1880, right? Becoming this sort of definitive telling.
Exactly. That's the way
Okay. So with that background set, let's unpack these narratives. Let's look at the differences, but also maybe the consistent threads that run through them.
All right. Our journey starts with the 1832 account. This is the earliest known record we have, actually, in Joseph's own handwriting, part of a short autobiographical manuscript. And the tone is really intimate, almost confessional.
Intimate and confessional. And what stands out in that telling? What's the focus?
The emphasis is really on Joseph's personal redemption, his deep yearning for forgiveness of sins, his search for true religion. The vision itself describes him praying, seeing the Lord, singular, who forgave his sins.
Okay, the Lord, singular. So crucially, this account implies only one divine speaker, seemingly Christ.
That's how it reads, yes. And what's notably absent, especially when you compare it to the later versions, is any explicit mention of 2 separate personages, father and son. There's no description of a dark opposition or a satanic attack.
And what about the question of which church to join?
also missing from this account. In fact, in 1832, Joesph writes that he had already concluded from studying the scriptures that there was no society or denomination built on the true gospel, so he wasn't asking which to join. He felt none were right.
Interesting. He did mention afterward, though, that he couldn't find anyone who believed him right, suggesting he did share it, even back then, and faced disbelief.
Yes, that element of facing disbelief is present early on. Okay, so from that very personal 1832 entry, let's jump ahead 3 years to 1835. This account is found in a journal entry recorded by a scribe when Joesph was recounting his vision to a visitor, a man named Robert Matthews.
Okay, so the context is different talking to someone else. Does that change the story?
It does introduce some new elements. Here we see the first mention of a demonic attack or some kind of dark opposition, an adversary trying to bind his tongue before the divine light appears. It also uniquely mentions seeing many angels.
Many angels. Okay. And what about the divine beings themselves?
This is significant. The 1835 account explicitly says 2 heavenly personages appeared, but in sequence. It says something like the appearance of one divine personage who is followed shortly by another.
Ah, okay. So 2, but maybe appearing one after the other. And the emphasis shifts too, right? Less about personal sin.
Definitely. You can feel a clear shift. The central question now seems to be identifying the true church, rather than primarily dwelling on his personal sins. By 1835, Joseph's theology and his role had developed. He was actively trying to figure out which church, if any, was correct, which is a subtle but important shift from the 1832 account, where he felt he already knew none were right.
Mm-hmm. But still, the core narrative holds. Divine vision, answer to prayer, followed by people not believing him or persecution.
Exactly. The core stays consistent. Now that brings us to the 1838 account. This one is, by far, the most detailed, the best known. It was dictated in 1838 during a really tough time of opposition for the church, published in 1842, and like we said, it's the version now canonized in the Pearl of Great Price.
Right. This is the official history version, the one most people encounter first.
Precisely. And it frames the first vision as nothing less than the inaugural event in the rise and progress of the church. It gives it this immense foundational, almost institutional significance.
And it's packed with details, isn't it? His age 14, early spring 1820, that vivid description of the religious revival excitement in his area, which leads him to ponder which church is true, the inspiration from James 1.5.
Yes, all of that. Plus, the harrowing confrontation with a dark power, the pillar of light described as brighter than the noon sun, and then the clear appearance of 2 personages standing above him in the air.
And the specific dialogue, one pointing to the other and saying, "This is my beloved son, hear him."
Correct. And the message Joesph receives is also crystal clear. Join none of the churches because they were all wrong, and their leaders, the professors of creeds, were corrupt.
Now here's a key contrast you mentioned earlier, compared to 1832. This version stresses Joesph had not previously thought all churches were false. He explicitly states, "At this time it had never entered into my heart that all were wrong."
Right, which directly contradicts that certainty you see in the 1832 account. And this 1838 version plainly identifies the heavenly beings as God the Father and Jesus Christ, establishing that clear dual theophany that's so central to LDS doctrine today.
And the aftermath described here is also more dramatic, isn't it? Telling a Methodist minister, facing immediate contempt, great persecution arising.
Yeah, so the persecution element is much more emphasized in this official history.
Okay. One more primary account to cover 1842, the Wentworth Letter.
Right. This was a concise summary Joesph prepared for an educated, non-Mormon audience. It's the same letter that gave us the Articles of Faith, so the context is very much about presenting the church and its beliefs to outsiders.
So more of a summary. What does it include, and what does it leave out compared to 1838?
It reiterates the basic facts.
Yeah.
The religious excitement, Joseph's confusion, getting inspired by scripture, praying, and the appearance of 2 personages. But what's interesting is what it omits. It lacks the really dramatic flourishes of the 1838 version, the intense struggle with darkness, the specific dialogue condemning all the churches and their professors.
Probably a strategic choice for that audience, maybe?
Almost certainly. Trying to be concise and perhaps less provocative. But importantly, it does confirm that by 1842, Joesph was publicly and clearly stating that the Father and the Son appeared to him, and this Wentworth letter account was widely reprinted, so it really helps solidify that 2-personage story in the public presentation of the church.
Okay, so we've walked through the 4 main accounts. Let's try to synthesize this. When we compare them, what are the core consistencies that hold true across all of them?
Well, Joesph consistently maintained he had a vision from God in his youth, and that it came in answer to prayer. That never wavered. He never changed the story to something like, oh, it was just a dream or an idea. He always tied it to the concept that the existing religions somehow lacked true authority or the fullness of truth.
Right. And all accounts agree he was alone in the woods praying. The experience was unexpected, sort of beyond his normal capacity.
Exactly, and his testimony of the vision's reality itself stayed incredibly firm. He famously declared later, "I had seen a vision, I knew it, and I knew that God knew it, and I could not deny it." That conviction is consistent.
Okay. But then there are the differences. And let's be frank, some of them are pretty significant, right? What are the most notable ones that critics latch onto?
Absolutely. The most striking one, and the one that generates the most debate, is the number and identity of the divine beings. You go from the 1832 account mentioning only the Lord, singular, seemingly Christ, to later accounts explicitly introducing two distinct personages, the Father and the Son.
And critics jump on that, saying that's not a minor detail you just forget or casually omit. It's like the central feature changing.
Precisely. They call it the story's crowning detail. Then there's the difference in Joseph's pre-vision mindset. Was he anguished by sin and already convinced no church was true, like in 1832? Or was he genuinely unsure which church was right and specifically asking for guidance, like in 1838?
Yeah, those seem hard to square perfectly. They feel like they contradict each other about his state of mind going into the woods.
They do. Another point is the revival context. The 1838 account gives this vivid description of a big 1820 revival. But the earlier accounts don't mention it, and as we'll discuss, some historical investigation raises questions about whether a revival of that specific type and scale happened right there in 1820.
Okay, and the aftermath details also shift a bit.
Right. 1838 emphasizes heavy, immediate persecution. 1832 is much more subdued, just says no one believed him and he kind of kept it in his heart. And the theological focus definitely evolves. The earliest account is very much about personal forgiveness and a general sense of apostasy. Later ones really stress his prophetic calling, that God had a specific work for him to do, and that no existing church was God's.
Bro, so with all those variations laid out clearly, the unavoidable question comes up. What do these differences imply about Joesph Smith's honesty? And that really brings us to the heart of the critical perspective.
It does. And perhaps the most foundational suspicion for critics stems from that delay in public knowledge we mentioned earlier. The fact that Joesph didn't widely or publicly speak about this specific first vision narrative for over a decade after 1820, early church publications, early witness accounts, they're largely silent on it.
Which leads some critics, like biographer Fawn Brodie back in the day, to conclude he essentially concocted the vision years after he said it happened. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
That it was retrofitted?
That's the core argument from that perspective, yes. That the narrative was developed later, perhaps retrofitted to provide a stronger divine endorsement for his prophetic claims or for later theological ideas. They point to its abscess even in places where you might expect it, like the 1830 Doctrine and Covenants section 20, which talks about Joseph's early experiences but refers more vaguely to maybe forgiveness or manifestations, not this grand theophany.
And it's not just official documents, right? You mentioned his mother, Lucy Smith. Her detailed history doesn't mention her son seeing God and Jesus in 1820 either.
Correct. And for critics, that kind of silence from close family members is pretty telling. It strongly suggests to them that the story either didn't exist in its full later form yet, or it just wasn't considered as crucially important back then as it later became.
Okay, then there's this 1820 revival problem you hinted at. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Sure. Joseph's 1838 account, the official one, vividly describes this unusual excitement from religious revivals happening in his specific area in 1820. But historian Wesley Walters, back in the 1960s, did a deep dive into local records, church minutes, newspapers, journals.
And what did he find? Or not find?
He concluded there was basically no major, widespread interdenominational revival happening right there near Manchester, New York, in that specific year, 1820, that matched Joseph's description. Instead, he found clear evidence of significant revivals and surges in church memberships in that area, but they were concentrated around 1824.
1824. And didn't Joseph's mother's history also mention a big revival around that later time, after her son Alvin died in 1823?
Exactly. Lucy Smith's history confirms a great revival around that 1823-1824 period, which led her and some of her children to join the Presbyterians. So the critical argument becomes, Joesph likely remembered the well-documented 1824 revival, but essentially moved the story back to 1820 in his later telling to place his foundational vision at the younger age of 14.
And for critics, that discrepancy suggests the first vision story, at least as told in 1838, was partly manufactured, maybe grafting elements onto real events from a later year. That definitely raises questions.
It does for them, yes. Another major point for critics is how the details seem to become increasingly glorious over time. They see that evolution from one lord, or maybe an angel in the earliest hints, to the full Father and Son theophany with brilliant light as a clear sign of embellishment.
And they connect this to his changing theology.
Directly. They argue his earliest theology, say in the 1820s and reflected in the 1832 account, was closer to a more traditional view, maybe modalism or something, where Jesus is God the Father. That aligns with the singular Lord in 1832. But by the mid-1830s, his theology had clearly evolved to distinguish the Father and Son as separate, distinct personages.
And that fits the later vision accounts.
Perfectly. Critics also point to things like the 1837 revisions Joesph made to the Book of Mormon, where he sometimes added phrases like the Son of before the Eternal Father as potential evidence he was consciously retrofitting earlier texts to align with this newer, separate personage's view of the Godhead.
So the critical question becomes pretty pointed. If God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared as distinct beings in 1820, why didn't the 1830 Book of Mormon or the 1832 First Vision account reflect that clearly? Some critics don't mince words, calling it willfully dishonest to ignore that apparent mismatch.
Yeah, it's a sharp critique. And then you have those internal contradictions we touched on. Was Joesph already told in the vision that all churches were false, implied in 1832? Or did that idea genuinely never enter his heart until Christ explicitly told him so, as stated in 1838?
Both can't be literally true at the same moment in time.
Exactly. And critical historians like Dan Vogel warn against too easily dismissing these kinds of contradictions as just faulty memory. Vogel argues the scale of change here, especially regarding his pre-vision certainty, goes beyond normal forgetfulness. He basically says that's just not something you would forget or leave out of your earliest written account in 1832.
Okay. And the final piece for the critics is the lack of contemporary evidence, not just for the vision itself, but for the persecution Joesph claimed followed immediately.
Correct. Joesph, especially in the 1838 account, claimed telling his vision in 1820 brought immediate and severe persecution. But critics find this largely implausible and, more importantly, completely unsupported by any contemporary records from that time and place. Local newspapers, church minutes, personal diaries. They're silent about any such controversy surrounding a teenage Joesph Smith claiming a vision of God back in 1820.
And there's that odd detail about him trying to join the Methodist probationary class in 1828.
Yeah, critics point to that as strange behavior if, as the 1838 account suggests, Methodist ministers had essentially branded him as inspired by the devil 8 years earlier. Why try to join their class?
So the argument is the persecution narrative might have been dramatized later.
That's the argument. The complete lack of contemporary corroboration suggests to critics that the story simply wasn't being told back then, which in turn supports their view that it was likely a later invention or elaboration.
So, to sum up the critical perspective, they see a story that changed significantly over time in ways that conveniently align with Joesph Smith's evolving theological needs and his efforts to solidify his prophetic authority. It morphed, in their view, from maybe a personal quest for forgiveness into a grand, foundational divine commissioning.
That's a fair summary of the critical position. It raises serious questions about historical accuracy and honesty.
Okay, that's a pretty compelling critical case based on the inconsistencies in the historical context.
Yeah.
But now let's pivot. How do proponents, the faithful perspective, address these same variations? They obviously don't see them as proof of dishonesty.
No, they don't. Latter-day Saint scholars and defenders readily acknowledge the differences exist, but they argue these variations are neither surprising nor discrediting. In fact, the official church essays state the accounts tell a consistent story, though naturally they differ in emphasis and detail. The core argument is that variations are simply expected when someone recounts a profound, life-altering experience multiple times over many years.
Expected. How so? Do they offer parallels?
They do. A common parallel drawn is from the Bible itself. The New Testament contains multiple accounts of Paul's vision on the road to Damascus, right there in the book of Acts. And those accounts have slight differences in details, like who heard what or saw what among his companions. Yet scholars generally don't treat these variations as proof Paul fabricated the whole thing.
Interesting point. So the argument is, if Joesph were making it all up, wouldn't he try harder to keep the story exactly the same every time?
That's precisely one line of reasoning. The very presence of discrepancies, some argue, could actually indicate an honest, spontaneous recalling of a real event rather than a carefully rehearsed lie. Law enforcement sometimes gets suspicious of a story that's too perfectly consistent because truthful witnesses often recall details slightly differently each time they recount it. Liars sometimes over-rehearse.
Okay, that's one angle. What about the different contexts for each account? Does that explain the different emphasis?
That's a major argument for the faithful perspective. Each account had a very distinct audience and purpose, which naturally explains why certain aspects were highlighted or maybe downplayed. The 1832 account. That was a private journal entry, focused inward on personal reflection, sin, forgiveness, a very intimate spiritual moment.
Makes sense. And 1838.
That was the official history, written for the church during a time of intense conflict and persecution. So naturally, it frames the vision as the epical opening of the Restoration, emphasizing the apostasy of other churches and Joseph's divine commissioning to fix it. The purpose was institutional, foundational.
Okay, and 1835, talking to that visitor.
Right, a conversation with a specific, maybe somewhat eccentric individual. That context might explain the unique mention of angels or the more cautious, sequential description of the two personages. He might have been tailoring it specifically for that listener. And 1842, the Wentworth letter.
For a non-Mormon audience.
Exactly. So it was concise, focused on the basics, and likely avoided some of the more dramatic or theologically challenging elements that might put off an outside reader. The argument is this tailoring doesn't show dishonesty, but rather Joesph being a relatable narrator, emphasizing what felt most important or appropriate for his listeners at that specific time.
Right. What about the sheer passage of time and the nature of memory itself? That must play a role.
Absolutely. And this is where modern cognitive science actually offers some support for the faithful perspective. We now understand that memory isn't like a video recording, it's inherently reconstructive. When we recall something, especially from long ago, we piece it together, and our current understanding, experiences, and even biases can color and shape how we remember it.
Like that phrase, all memory is false to some degree.
Exactly. Psychologists Bernstein and Loftus put it that way. There was a 12-year gap just between the vision in 1820 and the first known written account in 1832, and then even more years passed before the later accounts. That's ample time for these natural memory processes to work.
So, the idea is Joseph's understanding of the vision might have deepened over time.
That's a key argument. What he initially interpreted or focused on could later be seen in a fuller light as his own prophetic understanding grew. They might call it increasing insight. Maybe he initially focused just on Christ's forgiving role, but later came to appreciate the distinct presence and role of the Father more fully. Also, remember Joesph himself mentioned finding writing difficult early on, calling it a narrow prison in 1832. Maybe the ease of dictation later allowed for richer detail compared to his own handwriting.
Okay, but how do they specifically address that big one? The shift from one Lord in 1832 to two distinct beings later. That still feels like a major change.
The common response is that the 1832 account doesn't explicitly deny a second personage was present. It simply doesn't mention one. The argument goes, Joesph might have focused solely on Jesus Christ in that personal confessional account because Jesus was the one who delivered the direct message, the forgiveness of sins, which was the core of Joseph's concern at that moment he was writing in 1832.
So, the Father's brief introduction, while theologically huge later on, might have seemed less immediately relevant to that specific 1832 testimony about forgiveness.
That's the idea. They also suggest both motivations seeking forgiveness and wanting to know which church was true were likely present in 14-year-old Joesph back in 1820. He simply chose to emphasize different aspects, different starting points when retelling the story later, depending on the context and his purpose at the time.
Okay, and the response to the 1820 revival date objection. Did Walters get it wrong?
Proponents argue Walters maybe took an overly rigid, localized view. Joesph described excitement affecting the whole district, not just the tiny village of Palmyra. And LDS historians have found evidence suggesting there were scattered revival activities, Methodist camp meetings, and preaching by prominent revivalists in the broader region around 1819-1820, consistent with Joesph saying the excitement commenced with the Methodists.
So maybe Joseph's memory compressed a longer period of general religious fervor.
Possibly. The argument is that there was unusual religious excitement around that time, even if not one single massive revival exactly as Walters looked for in Palmyra Village records, and the silence in the 1820s. That could be explained by Joesph simply keeping a very sacred and perhaps initially confusing experience private until he felt prompted or mature enough to record it, especially given the ridicule he said he faced early on.
Okay. And finally, defenders often point to Joesph Smith's character, his consistency in affirming the vision throughout his life, right?
Yes, they emphasize he never recanted, despite facing intense scorn, opposition, and even violence. He risked his credibility, his safety, everything by claiming something so extraordinary as a direct vision of God was a highly controversial claim back then, even more so than seeing an angel.
The argument being, a fraudster might choose an easier, less controversial lie, like
Yep.
just an angel.
Exactly. They interpret his boldness in asserting he saw both God the Father and Jesus Christ as a sign of genuine, unwavering conviction, not a calculated deception,
Yes.
and waiting to publish the full story. That could be seen not as hiding something, but as exercising caution and treating the experience with sacredness, waiting until the church was more established and perhaps he felt divinely directed to share the complete narrative.
So wrapping up the faithful view, the inconsistencies, while acknowledged, are seen as less important than the core consistencies. They see a coherent story of a theophany leading to a divine restoration. The differences are attributed to understandable normal factors like memory, audience focus, passage of time, and Joseph's own evolving understanding and ability to articulate an ineffable experience. It's a prophet grappling with the transcendent, not a deceiver spinning a tale.
That's a good summary. So we have these two strong competing frameworks for interpreting the same set of historical documents.
To help us weigh these perspectives, maybe you can bring in some broader expertise. What does, say, memory science or even forensic analysis tell us about how we should view inconsistencies in testimony?
That's a great angle. Memory science, as we touched on, really emphasizes that memory is fundamentally reconstructive, not reproductive. Cognitive psychology shows that distortions, omissions, alterations, even conflations can happen as part of normal, even adaptive cognitive processes. Our brains try to extract the gist, the general meaning, and sometimes sacrifice specific details along the way.
So inaccuracies don't automatically mean the core event didn't happen.
Not at all. Decades of research on eyewitness testimony in legal settings confirm this. Minor inconsistencies in recalling details are incredibly common among truthful witnesses. What investigators look for is consistency in the central facts, the core narrative. And Joseph's central claim, "I saw a divine vision involving Jesus Christ," and later specified the Father too in the woods after praying, remained constant. The variations are more in the surrounding details and emphasis.
What about from a forensic psychology perspective? How do they view inconsistencies versus, say, a story that never changes?
It's nuanced. Modern training emphasizes caution. Yes, significant inconsistencies, especially in core facts that keep changing, can be indicators of deception. But, counterintuitively, an overly consistent, perfectly polished story that never varies one bit can also be a red flag.
Why is that?
Because liars often focus heavily on memorizing and rehearsing their story to keep it straight. Truth tellers, on the other hand, are retrieving actual complex memories, which by their nature might come out slightly differently each time they access and reconstruct them.
And how might Joseph's behavior fit into this, like his initial hesitancy to share widely?
Well, you could argue that behavior being hesitant, not trumpeting this supposedly foundational vision from day one, is somewhat inconsistent with someone fabricating a grand lie purely for personal gain or attention. Why hide your best lie, the one that gives you ultimate authority, for over a decade?
Good point. And the fact that the 1832 account just sat there, unpublished, in the letter book for years.
Right. That lack of careful curation or effort to synchronize all the accounts could suggest he wasn't meticulously managing a deception like a skilled trickster might. He just told his story at different times for different reasons, and the records reflect that.
It also seems plausible, doesn't it, that he might have initially withheld or soft-pedaled, as you said, the most radical part, seeing two distinct divine beings, simply because he knew how incredible, how theologically challenging that would sound to his audience at the time.
Absolutely. Historian Richard Bushman makes this point. He notes that in some early public references, Joesph might have spoken more generally about seeing a vision or angels, perhaps strategically covering the fact of the full theophany to avoid immediate dismissal or intense backlash. Only later, in private writings like 1832 or in the official history of 1838 when the church was more established, did he feel able, or perhaps prompted, to frankly assert the full, potentially shocking claim.
So that suggests maybe a strategic communication choice, adapting to his audience, which isn't necessarily the same thing as deliberate dishonesty about the event itself.
Exactly. It could be seen as prudence or understanding his listeners, rather than outright deceit. So the takeaway from these expert fields, memory science and testimony analysis, is that it's certainly plausible Joesph could have been entirely honest about having had a profound experience, yet still produce narratives that varied over time due to normal human cognitive processes and communicative choices.
If you start from the premise that he sincerely believed he had a spiritual experience, it's not hard to see how the telling of it could evolve or grow as he reflected on it. Maybe without him consciously feeling he was lying. He might have just felt he was understanding it better or finding better ways to articulate what God had shown him.
That's a very reasonable possibility, factoring in how memory and testimony work.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together now. Weighing all the evidence we've discussed, the consistencies, the inconsistencies, the context, the expert insights, what are the strongest points on each side, ultimately?
For the critical perspective, the strongest points really remain. The significant omissions in the earliest 1832 account, especially the absence of the father. The historical context issues, like the questions around the 1820 revival timing and that prolonged lack of early public mention or corroboration. And the apparent alignment between the evolving vision details and Joseph's developing theology, particularly the shift from one to two divine beings.
And that internal contradiction about his pre-vision mindset, already knowing all churches were wrong versus learning it in the vision, it's still a tough one to easily reconcile, isn't it?
It is. It's one of the harder points to harmonize smoothly. On the other side, for the faithful perspective, the strong points include the very normality of variations in recounting profound experiences, like the Paul parallel. The fact that the 1832 account exists at all, even with its differences, actually undermines the simple idea that the vision was entirely fabricated later, say in 1838.
Right. It shows something was being recorded early on.
Exactly. The core harmony across all accounts, seeking God, having a vision, being told the churches were lacking, leading eventually to restoration, that basic narrative holds up. The evidence for some kind of regional religious excitement around 1820 helps counter the strictest version of the no revival claim. And of course, the known fallibility and reconstructive nature of human memory provides a non-deceptive explanation for many of the changes.
Which brings us back in a way to the motive question. Was the evolution of the story driven by a need to shore up his authority during difficult times in the late 1830s? Or did the vision featuring a distinct father and son simply emerge more clearly in his memory or understanding as his doctrine on the Godhead, perhaps received through ongoing revelation, developed?
It's that classic chicken and egg problem, isn't it? Did the doctrine change because he remembered more details of the vision accurately? Or did he adjust the vision story, maybe unconsciously, maybe consciously, to better support the doctrine as it evolved? If you accept the premise of ongoing revelation, then he might have felt increasingly comfortable understanding and sharing the full nature of that initial experience as time went on.
So, logically, we seem to be left with a few main ways to interpret all this. What are they?
I think you can boil it down to maybe three main interpretations. First, Joesph was entirely truthful. The event happened essentially as he ultimately described it in the official account, and the minor inconsistencies in earlier tellings are just due to normal human memory factors, different contexts, and maybe his initial difficulty articulating it. In this view, his honesty is fundamentally intact.
Okay, interpretation one. Truthful with normal human variations. What's second?
Second, Joesph had some kind of genuine, profound spiritual experience in the grove, but the specific details, particularly the grandest ones, perhaps grew or became embellished over time, maybe even unconsciously, as he reflected on its significance and tried to explain it. This view doesn't necessarily see him setting out to lie, but suggests he was, let's say, prone to narrative evolution when dealing with something maybe ineffable. His core sincerity might still be there, but the historical accuracy of the later details is questioned.
A sort of middle ground, real experience, but details evolved. And the third interpretation.
The third is the critical view we outlined, that Joesph largely fabricated or significantly altered the story, especially the later versions, for strategic purposes to gain authority, support his doctrines, create a foundational myth. The differences aren't just memory slips, they're seen as indicators of a manufactured or heavily manipulated tale. Under this view, his honesty regarding the first vision is fundamentally compromised.
So truthful, evolved, or fabricated. If we try to step back and be as objective as possible, what can we say with reasonable confidence?
Well, objectively, the existence of multiple, varied accounts, rather than one single, static, perfectly memorized story, actually argues against the idea that Joesph was just reciting a simple, pre-planned fiction from day one. The time gap between the event and the first written accounts, while raising questions, isn't automatically fatal when you consider how memory works and the potential reasons for delaying recording.
And the lack of early public mention.
It can be plausibly explained by factors other than non-existence, such as fear of ridicule, the sacredness of the event, or the Church's early focus being primarily on the Book of Mormon as the main evidence of Joseph's claims.
But that major content change, one divine being versus two, that remains the trickiest part.
Undoubtedly, that's the change that requires the most explanation from either side. However, as we discussed, it's plausible, even within an honest framework, that Joesph might have initially soft-pedaled or focused differently on this radical theological aspect due to audience concerns or his own understanding, only to assert it more frankly later as circumstances changed. And significantly, once the official 1838 version was established and published, Joesph stuck to that narrative consistently.
So this whole controversy over the changing first vision accounts, it really throws a spotlight on that fundamental tension between human memory, human communication, and claims of divine experience, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Critics tend to argue that truth, especially divine truth revealed by God, should be unchanging, perfectly consistent. If God the Father and Jesus Christ really appeared, shouldn't the story be identical every time? Any variation casts doubt on the event itself.
Whereas supporters tend to emphasize the human element. They see a human prophet grappling to understand and articulate a transcendent, maybe even ineffable event. They argue it's natural for the telling to evolve as the person grows, as their understanding deepens, and as the needs of their audience change. For them, the core experience remains true, even if the narrative expression varied.
Exactly. And that's why, as a Latter-day Saint essay on the topic concludes, ultimately, neither the truth of the first vision nor the arguments against it can be proven by historical research alone. The historical documents show us the variations, the context, the timelines, but assessing Joesph Smith's honesty, his internal state, inevitably comes down to interpretation, how one weighs the evidence, how one understands memory, testimony, and the possibility of divine interaction itself.
It seems if you expect a prophet, or anyone recounting a profound spiritual event, to give a single, immutable deposition-style testimony that never changes a word over decades, then yes, Joesph Smith's accounts will likely disappoint or raise suspicion.
But if you allow for the possibility that prophets, like all human beings, might share profound experiences in a piecemeal fashion, emphasizing different aspects at different times based on context or inspiration, and that their own understanding of the event might even deepen over time, then Joseph's pattern doesn't necessarily have to impugn his honesty. The variations become understandable facets of a developing testimony.
It really makes you think. This deep dive leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener. When we encounter any story, maybe even in our own lives or from people we know, that changes in the telling over time, what do we instinctively prioritize? Do we demand meticulous, unchanging consistency in every single detail as the primary marker of truth? Or do we focus more on the apparent conviction, the consistency of the core claim, the lasting impact of the experience on the person telling it? What does that choice reveal about our own expectations of truth, memory, and maybe even human nature itself?